Welcome back to Encyclopedia.zone. My name is Dr. Don Jolly. I am the editor-in-chief of Encyclopedia.zone, which is a HTML website featuring the greatest shit posts in a literary vein on the internet, including our most recent update, the Mayhem Update, with layouts by Container Core of Zone House Northwest, featuring the best reporting, shitposting, and photos of the beginnings of the present wave of civil unrest that is sweeping the nation. If you've seen, everybody has seen what Portland is like right now. But if you want to go back, you want to take a sentimental journey to a few months ago when it was nothing but broken Target windows, then head on over to Encyclopedia.zone, check out the Mayhem Update, and enjoy it. We are going to have, I think, 2 more Mayhem Updates as we press forward into the future. I do have to apologize once again for being absent from the internet. It is very difficult for me to appear on camera right now. I'm sorry to say that. But I unfortunately had a death in the family, which has been very disruptive, both, I don't want to say that this is strictly an emotional issue, although that is a component of it. It has been very disruptive practically, because I'll tell you what happened. The whole world right now is in this weird position where a lot of things that used to happen IRL, as they say, have been forced to happen online. I'm talking to my grandmother on Zoom. I didn't know what the fuck Zoom was in January. But now I am having my conversation with my grandmother about the cat that hangs out in her garden on a video teleconferencing platform that, as far as I know, was created by the CIA as a way to collect the cookie recipes of innocent Americans. Everybody's been forced online. Meanwhile, because, once again, of this unfortunate personal circumstance, I have been pulled out of the very online world that I was existing in and forced to reckon with the world of the pandemic IRL, because this was not just the kind of death that, it happens and then the only work that remains is emotional. This was the kind of death that, you've got paperwork to do, you've got chores that need doing. This was a significant void in my life and the life of a lot of people that I love. And so I have been doing my best to try and fill it, or at least be useful. And that work does not happen on the computer. So I haven't been on the computer, and when I do peek my head in, obviously this is going to be a very politically tense time in terms of online discourse, in terms of mass media discourse in general, both television and in the more traditional press and those sorts of things, because it's an election year. But in addition to it being an election year, it is a highly contested election year, and it is also a year of profound failure. It's a year where anybody who could count themselves as an earnest believer in Trumpism must, on some level, admit that it has failed. It is a year where anybody who believes themselves an earnest participant in the American left, the progressive wing of American politics, must look at the performance of the Bernie Sanders campaign and its ultimate fate and say that on some level this too has failed. And it is certainly a year where the centrists have failed, our information delivery systems, news media have failed. To sum up my feeling on politics at the moment, I would say that politics has failed in America today. And every time I take a break from my real life duties, cleaning up after this incalculable tragedy, I peek into Twitter and I immediately become so enraged and so disgusted. And it's like the people that I post with on Twitter, like my mutuals and stuff, they're mostly just like artists or funny people, I follow a lot of news accounts too. I follow a lot of politicians and a lot of news magazines and stuff like that. The people that I actually know on Twitter are great, and I love talking to them. But when I start up that fucking app, I start up that fucking website, I just get inundated on the new tweets page with it's almost like an algorithm has spit up words in a particular order to make me feel a complete mixture of outrage and disgust. And I'm just not interested in feeling that way. I also doubt whether feeling that way is truly what it is to be informed. If politics has failed, and I believe, like, if you look at the economic situation of our country right now, and you look at the institutions that exist to address it, and their ideas for addressing it, and the willpower that they seem to have in addressing the largest contraction of GDP since the Great Depression, the largest contraction of GDP ever, actually. 30 million Americans out of work, joblessness claims going through the roof, small businesses folding up left and right. You know, they look at my town, you know, Austin, Texas, vacating itself of places that have been around for 20, 30 years, just becoming progressively a ghost town day by day. And you look at what the political responses are, and you recognize it's just chaos. It's ideological chaos, it's rhetorical chaos, and in a lot of cases, it is actual violent chaos in the streets. I'm not interested in picking good guys or bad guys or hunting for examples of political hypocrisy. This entire idea that somehow we're going to sit around and with our present cosmographic divides, with people living in the realities that they do, the bifurcated realities of our political spectrum, the idea that we're somehow going to engage in a productive discourse which is going to solve any of the very apparent and very serious woes that are besetting us seems to me to be a joke. If politics has failed, there's really nothing else to say about it. And every time I peek onto the internet, you know, specifically onto Twitter, but, you know, the news feeds, this other stuff that I was reading, I start to feel that terrible anxiety. And it's very difficult for me to get online. But this time around, like I said, I feel like politics has failed. I don't want to participate in the discourse I don't want to participate in a failed discourse. And I also don't want to just contribute to the cycle of derangement that seems to be driving so much of online posting these days. I don't want to make people who come to the channel more upset than when they left. So there's a million things I could talk about in terms of, like, the world's going to shit, everything's fucking miserable, you know, this is all fucking nightmarish. I could do those stories every fucking day, but you know what? I don't want to. I don't want to do that to you, and I don't think I could survive doing it to myself. So, you know what I've been doing? I've been reading books. Books are great. They are a very competitive technology because they don't beep at you. They don't offer any distractions. They never try to sell you Vietnamese dick pills. And they work when the power's out. They're very portable. There's a number of advantages to the standard analog book. So I've been reading quite a few of them. I've read some that I thought were very impressive. So we're going to go through some of my quarantine reading here. And I think we're actually just going to do more book reviews as time goes on. If you've been reading any good books, talk about them down in the comments below. And if you've been reading anything that you think I should check out specifically, you know, put in a recommendation. And you know, we'll see. I can't get to everything, obviously, and I'm going to be driven by my eccentricities, of course, in what I read. But I think that we could all benefit from a little bit more offline reading time. I certainly have. It's been putting my mind at ease very easily. So let's talk about some of these books that I've been checking out. Number one, we've got Pop 1280 by Jim Thompson. Jim Thompson, if you're not aware, is a excellent pulp crime writer. Probably most famous for The Getaway, The Killer Inside Me, and for writing the screenplay to The Killing, and I believe Paths of Glory, but definitely The Killing for Stanley Kubrick. Also The Grifters, which was adapted into a very good Stephen Frears film in the 90s. Pop 1280 is a piece of Jim Thompson that I had not read before. And it is about a small-town sheriff named Nick Corey that he's essentially a kind of ascended idiot savant of being a small-town Texas sheriff. He has an absolute understanding of what his role in the world is, namely that he beats up on the poor to give everybody the impression that there is law without the actuality of law, which would interfere with their variously disturbed, hollow, and vicious lives. This is a violent book. This is I don't want to say it's a racist book, but it is a book that touches, very extensively on the nature of racist violence in Texas and in the South, and its role in sort of creating the illusion of social cohesion. I would say that's like the main theme of the book, is the illusion of social cohesion. And I don't want to spoil the ending, but it all comes together into a bizarrely spiritual denouement that I think actually has some echoes of Flannery O'Connor. This was originally published in 1964, and I have to say, with the exception of The Getaway, which I think I probably enjoyed, The Getaway is one of my favorite crime books, and I think it also has a absolutely, amazing conclusion, but the level of theological complexity that Pop 1280 gets to, while also descending into great excesses of campy ultra violence and like super misery, it's kind of unique. This is a extremely notable book. I don't know if it's the best thing Jim Thompson ever wrote, but it's certainly, on a certain level, the most ambitious in a literary sense. It's interesting because it's narrated by Nick Corey in the first person, which is a trick that he uses in The Killer Inside Me too, with a lot of irony for the reader, because you can sort of see through the lies that Nick Corey tells other people and the lies that Nick Corey tells himself. And as he starts to come into more of a recognition of his position and more of an understanding of his character, he becomes more satanic and, sort of more self-actualized in this really perverse way. As a work of literature, it's one of Thompson's most interesting and definitely one of his best, but definitely not for the faint of heart. So check out Pop 1280 if you're looking for a fucking an interesting read. Next up, this is The Corporation by Joel Bakan. Joel Bakan is a lawyer. You'll note that this book has a quote by Noam Chomsky on the back, which should pretty much tell you what to expect in terms of its political leanings. But The Corporation it's only about 200 pages long, and it is a very short overview of the legal origin and legal grounding of limited liability corporations and corporate business structures in general, going back to their origin and tracing their ascendancy through the 19th century, and on into today, and at which point it kind of gets lost in sort of expected anti-corporate talking points. But I think that as a study, as a historical study, and especially as a bibliography, as a resource of other things to read about the foundation and importance of corporations, and especially the legal grounding of corporations, because once again, Joel Bakan is he's a legal scholar, so that's sort of the tack that he takes. It's not a business approach. It also has he got to interview Milton Friedman for this fucking book, and some of the shit that Friedman says, I mean, I don't know if you guys get, because I watch Diversity in Comics on YouTube a lot, so I think I get, the algorithm throws up a lot of fucking fucking Friedman fundamentals, like right-wing bullshit PragerU ads, and these Friedman fundamentals quotes, like, he's just such a fucking, I mean, they've got these little cartoons explaining like the most basic, most, just open-eyed, optimistic interpretations of free market capitalism that exist. And when you see Friedman talking in The Corporation by Joel Bakan, and props to Friedman for speaking to somebody who was clearly so much his ideological opposite, but the guy is a twisted freak. Milton Friedman is a fucking pervert. He is an economic pervert. And The Corporation does a really good job of sort of hanging him on his own petard. He's a little bit like the Nick Corey of this book, as a matter of fact. So this one, everybody's fucking read this. This is Game of Thrones by George R.R. Martin. This is the first volume of the fantasy series. And, yeah, what can I say? I mean, this book is so fucking successful, and I'm sure so polarizing for so many people that have read it, have read it years before I did, that have read all the other books, which I have not, that it's sort of useless for me to offer any kind of opinion on it. I will say that Game of Thrones it was much better than I thought it would be. It was very diverting. I expected it to be entertaining, but I did not expect it to end as strongly, or to start as strongly as it did, because it has a really, like, that first 300 pages, because it's like a 900-page book, but those first 300 pages, like, you really feel like he's going somewhere with it, and it's so tight. The introduction of all the characters, all the Stark children, on into the introduction of Tyrion going to the Wall. All of that stuff is so fucking strong. And after that, it's the latter half of this book. I do think that there's some parts of it that succumb to, well, I know that this character's got to be at point Z, by the conclusion. So right now he's at point C, and we've got to fill in, like, where was he? There's a lot of traveling and chance encounters and, like, weird repetitions, which I would assume get worse as the series gets longer. For example, the example that I think stood out the most to me was Tyrion Lannister ends up in the hills, or the mountains around the Vale of Arryn, and he meets up with the hill tribes. These are barbarian hillmen. And, there's also, like, this whole thing is pretty clearly, like, a Tolkien analog, which I don't necessarily begrudge it for. Like, Daenerys is clearly, like, a kind of a Sauron, because she's going to go invade England, Westeros, but she's going to invade England with an army of monsters and black people. But, she's seen from a sympathetic light and blah, blah, blah. Like, she's not exactly Sauron. There's hill tribes in the Lord of the Rings also. So I think that's probably why they end up in this to begin with. But the problem is that we already have this really detailed barbarian culture across the sea with Daenerys when she's hanging out with the Dothraki, who, like, the Dothraki chapters are some of the best parts of the book. I fucking love the Dothraki chapters. There's a very credible little society there. And I'm afraid that the Stone Crows and the Burned Men, the hill tribes over there, they just end up feeling like pale imitations, less interesting versions of the Dothraki. The Dothraki seem barbaric from a Westerosi perspective, but they have their own reason for doing things. Everything comes out of the way that they live their lives. There's a certain anthropological interest in going through the Dothraki culture, whereas you've got these barbarian hillmen hanging out in the Tyrion chapters towards the end of this book that are, they're just kind of dumb. That's like the joke of them, and it's like, really, we're gonna do that. And I think that it's because he had Tyrion at the Vale of Arryn, and he needed Tyrion to be at one of the battles at the end with the fucking, what's his name, Roose Bolton's army. So in between the Vale of Arryn and Roose Bolton, he came up with this, the Hillmen and the whole thing. And, it's not horrible, but, like, I get the feeling that this is going to be kind of a Shaggy Dog story as I move on into succeeding volumes. And I do plan to move on into succeeding volumes because, this is an extremely high-selling book. This has had a massive cultural impact. And it's extremely diverting. It's well written to an extent, maybe not like on a sentence-by-sentence level, but extremely vivid characters. Great page turner, and it's sometimes you want to just melt away the hours in the novel equivalent of an open world video game, and that's Game of Thrones. And you know what? Like, look, all of my criticism, if he threads all of this shit together by the time the rest of the books come out and actually performs a conclusion that gives a good thematic resonance to the whole thing, as might occur, then he will have produced something that could, not just be very successful, monetarily and in terms of immediate cultural impact, but he could create something that could be a true classic of its genre. And maybe just a true classic writ large, depending on how much how well he can deliver on the thematic promise of the thematic promise of those first like 100 pages where Game of Thrones is getting going. So I'm going to move on to A Clash of Kings, and we'll see from there. I'm not making any promises that I'm going to finish the whole series, because I don't know. It's up in the air for me. We'll see how much I really want to dive into a fantasy novel, because I don't read them all the time, and I also am currently at the end of one that I think is much superior to a Game of Thrones, called Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell by Susanna Clarke. So we'll talk about that on a future episode. Speaking of diverting page turners, we've also got Star Trek: The Case of the Colonist's Corpse by Bob Ingersoll and Tony Isabella. This is a weird one. Okay, so I don't know how many people watched Comic-Con at home. I know I sure didn't, but they're promoting this fucking thing. They got one of the Neanderthals that makes Rick and Morty. I'm sorry, that was insulting. They got one of the robot rape machines that produces Rick and Morty, that commits usually crimes against humanity in the production of the insulting televised nightmare that is Rick and Morty, to make a Star Trek show. So it's like Star Trek Rick and Morty. And I still, for God help me, but like every once in a while I'll take a look at io9.com just because I want to, like, I want to feel a cringe that goes all the way from the balls of my feet to the tip of my nose. And I see people praising this thing, and it's like, you know, let's talk about fucking, like, what licensed media is, what, like, you know, what do these fucking brands mean? This fucking book, Star Trek: The Case of the Colonist's Corpse, this is not a great work of literature, but you know what it is? You can't see it, but the pages are tinted red. My hat and my shirt are actually red. In actual fact, I just fuck with the colors, but they're tinted red because that's the way that Earl Stanley Gardner, Perry Mason novels were tinted. And this is a Perry Mason novel starring a character that appeared in one episode of Star Trek: The Original Series, named Samuel T. Cogley. He is Captain Kirk's defense attorney from the episode Court Martial, who is played by Alicia Cook Jr., who actually also appeared in The Killing, which was written by Jim Thompson. So, interesting correspondence there. This is a silly book. The Case of the Colonist's Corpse is a silly book. I don't have anything to say about the actual plot mechanics, but, you know, if you're looking for a piece of popcorn fluff to just pop into your mouth to distract you from the nightmare of your own life, it is full of so much respect and appreciation for not just the original Star Trek show, and for this very minor character who's only, you know, going to be on the radar of people that are pretty dedicated Star Trek fans to begin with. But it's also full of appreciation for Earl Stanley Gardner, for Perry Mason, and for the genre of the legal thriller in general. It is a disposable, you know, read it in an afternoon paperback that is based on an existing brand, actually several existing brands, although it only like had to pay for one of them because they don't make any written acknowledgement of Perry Mason within the actual text. They certainly didn't like get the rights to Perry Mason in order to do the book. They just borrowed the form factor and the form factor both physically and literarily. And it's also simultaneously made with a lot of very earnest and devoted love and attention. And you could say that that's, you know, misplaced maybe, but I think about this in context of the Star Trek Rick and Morty show, or like Star Trek Discovery, or the new Disney Star Wars movies, and it's like it's almost like these newer things aren't made by human beings. Like this Star Trek: The Case of the Colonist's Corpse was made by extremely nerdy human beings with a perhaps misplaced but profound appreciation of a number of pop cultural artifacts that they had come across in the earlier years of their life. This is a paperback written by people who love paperbacks, and I feel like modern media is... like, modern Star Trek feels like it's made by people who hate Star Trek and hate people that like it. Modern Star Wars feels like it's made by malevolent computers that hate human beings in general. So, as far as it goes, I had a pretty good time with the Case of the Colonist Corpse. And I'm not going to tell you who did it. But it was not the Klingon. It was not the Klingon. Klingon didn't do it. You think they're going to zig? They zag. It wasn't the Klingon. Last book that I read, this is The Eaters of the Dead by Michael Crichton, which was adapted in the film The 13th Warrior. Crichton wrote this in the 70s. And, Michael Crichton obviously wrote Jurassic Park, Westworld. He is of a breed of writer that, they still do exist. I mean, you've got, what's his name? Patterson. Stephen King, obviously. Stephen King's maybe a little different, but the blockbuster hyper seller airport paperback writer, and there are actually a few of those guys in the mid-century that I thought were pretty good. I like Michael Crichton probably the best of them because he actually has like pretty good science fiction premises in a bunch of his stories. Like, if you never read The Lost World, the Jurassic Park book, like, that's a pretty fucking good one. I liked that a lot when I was a kid, and I liked that it sort of existed. It had this pedagogical aspect to it, where it was teaching mathematical concepts to children in the guise of a dinosaur adventure book. And there's some element to that in the first Jurassic Park too. Like the Andromeda strain sort of exists as a that's actually a book that maybe we should all read right now. But Michael Crichton was a Harvard educated like medical doctor, and the Andromeda strain has a medical science angle to its science fiction premise, which I think is very interesting. And The Eaters of the Dead, according to what I read, this was Michael Crichton came up with this book, was occasioned to write this book, because he had gone to a lecture where somebody accused Beowulf of being, the Anglo-Saxon poem Beowulf, of being boring. And Michael Crichton did not like that, so he said he was going to write Beowulf in a framing that would make it interesting. And basically, Eaters of the Dead, it's weird. It is told from the perspective of an actual Arab chronicler named Ibn al-Fadlan, who really did have encounters with Norsemen back in the day, in AD 922. But this book supposes that he went further and sort of lived out a real-life version of the Beowulf story, where Grendel is replaced by monstrous Neanderthals known as the Wendal, where the mother of Grendel is sort of made a little bit more ineffable, more of a god figure, where the dragon that Beowulf fights is exploded into a particular battle formation of Wendal coming down a mountain with torches. Where essentially, like, the legends are true, but this is how they actually happened. And there's a big focus on the fact that because Fadlan is a Arab, and because he's approaching things with more of a rational mindset than the Norsemen do, that he's giving you sort of the unadorned truth of the events that happened and that inspired the Beowulf myth. But it's more complicated than that, because Ibn al-Fadlan does have a character arc within this book that is rendered through the way that he tells the story of Beowulf. And by the end of it, Beowulf has become Beowulf in Ibn al-Fadlan's eyes. And the thing that you are seeing is how he acclimates himself to the Northmen's culture and how he comes to take on enough of their perspective to produce the literary preconditions for the production of Beowulf. So it's essentially both an adventure story and an adventure story about the composition of a poem, about the nature of memory, the nature of storytelling, the nature of poetry. It's a little bit like Conan the Barbarian meets The Name of the Rose. It is not as good as either of those, but I thought it was a real solid, interesting little book. It is much better than I think people give it credit for. And people have asked me if I've seen The 13th Warrior, which is the book or the movie that was based on Eaters of the Dead, with Antonio Banderas, that was made in the 90s. And it's interesting, but I did see it at some point. I don't know if I finished it. I don't know if I remember it. I don't. It did not stick with me. And the thing is, everything that's cool about this book is so dependent on it being in the form of a book, in the form of a faux manuscript, which is how it's written. You know, it's written. It's not just narrated by Ibn al-Fadlan. It is written by Ibn al-Fadlan within the narrative of the book. It is so dependent on it being written that I don't think you can actually adapt it into a movie. I don't think there's a way to do that credibly. So I kind of True Grit sort of has this same problem where it's like the Coen Brothers True Grit is a real solid movie, but it does not capture what is good about the book, because you actually can't use the medium of film to capture what Charles Portis did in that novel, because it's dependent on the interplay between the nature of the story being told and the nature of the person telling that story. And you just can't pull off those kinds of juxtapositions in a primarily visual medium like film. You just can't. And so, weirdly, you know, if you turn Eaters of the Dead, the best movie you could make out of Eaters of the Dead would just be an adventure story, and it would miss out on all of the metatextual elements. I also really appreciate that he's got a faux bibliography in the back here, and the final entry on it is the Necronomicon, edited H.P. Lovecraft. So, you know, I always appreciate it when people doff their hats to their pulp forebears. And, you know, good for Michael Crichton. Eaters of the Dead, that's a solid recommend. I'm gonna go back through this and see if any of these are, I mean, I think they're kind of all recommends, but I'm gonna do just like one line on all of them. So, Eaters of the Dead, solid recommend. Great sort of metafictional adventure story. Definitely be familiar with Beowulf before you read it. Star Trek Case of the Colonist Corpse. Are you a big enough fucking dork to get anything out of this? You have to be a 12th degree fucking loser to enjoy this book. But I am, so I did. Game of Thrones. Doesn't matter what I say. Doesn't matter. Extremely successful. My criticism or my praise are completely to the side of this book's achievement. So, you know, it is what it is. The Corporation by Joel Bakan. I'm going to say this is actually required reading. If you're anybody that's interested in the formation of the corporation, the history of the corporation, this is a great place to start. Think of it as the first 2 weeks of a college course that you're teaching yourself. And it's got an excellent bibliography. So I definitely got a bunch of things that I have started reading out of the back of this book. And I believe you will too. Pop 1280, Jim Thompson, once again, not for everybody, not for the faint of heart. Extremely offensive, extremely problematic. Absolutely required reading. You will love it. But if you wanted to get into Jim Thompson, I would not start with it. I would start with The Getaway or The Killer Inside Me. Anyway, that's about all for this week, and we'll see you very soon on encyclopedia.zone.